Katie Rodriguez smoothed her scrubs as she pushed through the automatic doors of Oak Creek Memorial, her practice smile hiding 15 years of classified operations across 3 continents. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional green that made even healthy people look sick. Antiseptic tang sharp in her nostrils, bleach mixed with something chemical, something that smelled like surrender. It was 0600 hours. The veterans unit would be quiet for another 20 minutes before the day shift chaos erupted. She moved through the corridors with the kind of invisibility that only comes from understanding how to occupy a space without demanding anything from it. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted and fall line on the second-floor landing, and she paused long enough to press her palms flat against the cool stainless steel railing. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 15 years since she'd held a rifle under Helmand Province starlight, and her body still woke at 0400 in the morning expecting incoming fire. The chart on room for 12 read Captain Marcus Webb. 34 years old. Mute, no recorded voice since a blast concussion for months ago had left him medically unable to speak. Unresponsive to standard psychiatric evaluation. Occupational therapy had tried music therapy. Neurology had run every test. Nobody had gotten him to acknowledge anything beyond a blank stare at the ceiling and the occasional tremor in his left hand. Katie entered the room carrying fresh gauze and saline, the equipment clinking softly against the metal tray she held. The morning light hadn't reached this far west yet, so the room existed in that grey zone between night and day where nothing quite looked real. Captain Webb lay with his left arm outside the blanket, and that's when Katie saw it. The tattoo on his forearm. A symbol, 3 interlocking diamonds above the letters SEAL 3, Charlie Platoon. Her son's unit. The exact same ink, placed on the exact same spot on his forearm, in what looked like the exact same year. She set the tray down. Her fingers steadied immediately. This wasn't trembling anymore. This was something else entirely. "I'm going to change your dressing," she said quietly, peeling back the gauze on his wrist where the fall line had been adjusted 3 times in the past 2 days. Nobody had told her why, the charts just said difficult peripheral access and moved on. Katie could see the bruising pattern in the puncture marks though. 3 attempts by someone who didn't know what they were doing. Probably the new resident rotating through, the one who palpated with his eyes instead of his fingers. She inserted the new 4 with a single fluid motion, 18-gauge angiocath, placed perfectly at the median cubital, the needle entering at a 15-degree angle with that particular soft resistance that meant she was in the vein on the first try. No bruising. No fishing around. The kind of placement that came from doing this exact procedure 2,000 times, which she had, though not in a hospital. Captain Webb's eyes didn't move. But his fingers twitched. 3 quick movements, tap, 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 against his thigh. Katie recognized the pattern. Sign language. ASL. Tap 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 meant acknowledge. 3 taps meant confirmation of receipt. She touched his shoulder and held her hand there for exactly 2 seconds. Not speaking. Not explaining. Just bearing witness to the fact that she knew what he was trying to communicate. From the doorway, Dr. Sterling's voice came like ice forming on a windshield. "Nurse Rodriguez. A moment in the hallway, please." She withdrew her hand. Her expression didn't change. She'd become very good at expressions that didn't change. Dr. Sterling stood in the corridor with his tablet held like a shield across his chest, and Katie could read the calculation in his eyes before he opened his mouth, the moment when a predator assesses whether something is prey or competition. He was 48, with the kind of expensive haircut that required maintenance every 3 weeks and cufflinks that probably cost more than Katie made in a month. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a shine that suggested someone else did the polishing. "I've been reviewing the charts," he said, not looking at her directly, which was his tell. Never look at the threat directly when you're deciding whether to kill it. Your documentation on the medical supply inventory is exceptionally thorough. Almost obsessive. One might say, and here he turned to face her, and his smile was the kind a shark would make if sharks could take continuing education credits, one might say you have a talent for finding discrepancies. Katie kept her hands at her sides. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet, and it didn't shake. I chart what I see, Doctor. That's the job. Of course. He tapped the screen of his tablet 3 times with one finger. Tap, tap, tap. The same pattern Captain Webb had used. Probably coincidence. Probably not. The thing is, Nurse Rodriguez, meticulous charting is admirable in moderation. But there's a such thing as too much attention to detail. It can make people uncomfortable. It can make people question things that are, shall we say, not their business to question. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and remorseless as a heartbeat in a waiting room. I understand, Katie said. Do you? Dr. Sterling stepped closer, and the air pressure in the hallway seemed to shift. Not from anything he did physically, it was something about the way he moved, the way his presence colonized space. Like a predator testing the perimeter of a trap. Because I've been here for 17 years, Nurse Rodriguez. I've built something here. Relationships. Trust. Partnerships with medical supply companies that have allowed Oak Creek Memorial to operate at remarkable efficiency. Do you follow me? Katie did follow him. She followed him all the way to the conclusion that he was running something, a kickback scheme, a billing fraud, something systematic enough that 17 years of operation meant it was integrated into the institution like organ failure that nobody noticed because the patient had learned to breathe around it. 3 billing discrepancies in her charting over the past 2 weeks. She'd flagged them because the inventory numbers didn't match the supply counts, and when numbers don't match, that's information. Pain is data. Numbers are data. Everything is data if you know how to read it. I follow you, Katie said. Good. Dr. Sterling's smile widened, and he turned to walk back toward the nurse's station. I find that people who follow me tend to have much more pleasant careers. Much longer careers. We understand each other about what's important, patient care, institutional stability, not rocking boats that are sailing along quite nicely. He paused. Turned back. That new higher orientation module about reporting obligations, he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. The one about whistleblower protections and how to flag concerns to administration. I wouldn't focus too much energy on that particular training video. Policy versus reality, you understand. Oak Creek Memorial is a family. And family looks out for family. But family also understands when someone is looking for reasons to cause problems. Katie didn't respond. She watched him walk away, watched the way other staff members seemed to straighten up as he passed, the way nurses suddenly found urgent reasons to be somewhere else, the way his presence made them smaller. Back in room for 12, Captain Webb was still lying with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, but his left hand was moving again. That 3-tap pattern, over and over, like Morse code for something she understood on a frequency that nobody else in this hospital was tuned to. She crossed to the window and pulled back the thermal curtain. The San Diego dawn was breaking over the parking lot, turning everything copper and gold for exactly 40 seconds before the sun climbed higher and everything went white again. From her pocket, she withdrew something she hadn't shown anyone in Oak Creek Memorial yet. Something she kept in the deepest corner of her locker, wrapped in a canvas hospital gown that still smelled like Kandahar dust. A pair of worn combat boots. The sole was nearly shredded from 1,000 miles of patrol routes through villages with names nobody stateside could pronounce. The leather was cracked in a pattern that mapped to the shape of her own feet, and there were bloodstains on the left ankle that had faded to the color of old rust because some things don't wash out no matter how hard you scrub. She placed them on Captain Webb's nightstand, positioning them so the unit insignia faced him directly. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Stamped in fading letters on the heel. I served with someone from your unit, she said quietly. 18 months. 214 civilians evacuated from Jolin District. Your commanding officer was incredible. He saved my life. Twice. Captain Webb's 3 taps accelerated. Tap 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 tap. Rapid-fire acknowledgement, rapid-fire recognition, rapid-fire confirmation that he understood exactly what she was communicating and what those boots represented. What they didn't know was that in 15 years, Katie had never shown those boots to anyone. Not family, not friends, not even the therapist the Navy had mandated she see when she'd transitioned from active service to civilian life. Those boots represented a life that officially no longer existed, a woman who'd been ordered to vanish, a senior chief petty officer whose operations were classified so deeply that the redacted documents had redactions on top of the redactions. Dr. Sterling thought he understood what he was looking at. A competent new nurse with a meticulous eye for detail who asked inconvenient questions about inventory. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to the worst part. Room for 12 sat at the corridor's end, where afternoon light fell across white linoleum like a stage spotlight. Katie pushed the medication cart with one hand, Vital's clipboard tucked under her arm, when she heard the voices, a woman's sob, a man's steady murmur, the particular silence that belongs to families holding their breath beside hospital beds. She recognized Captain Marcus Webb's parents from the Gold Star photo on his nightstand. Webb himself lay motionless, eyes tracking her entrance with the precision of someone who'd learned to communicate without sound. The wound needed dressing. Fourth intercostal space, post-operative from the thoracic drain removal 3 days prior. Sterile technique. Saline rinse. Fresh 4x4 gauze. Katie had performed this procedure 47 times in her career, muscle memory lived in her hands now, each movement economical, practiced. She gathered supplies from the bedside cart, pulled on fresh nitrile gloves that snapped like small gunshots in the quiet room. Webb's mother stepped closer, watching with the intensity of someone who'd already lost too much. Katie's hands moved. Gentle. Precise. The old dressing peeled back, revealing skin that was healing exactly as it should, no erythema, no drainage, no sign of infection. Just the clean pink of tissue binding itself back together. She was halfway through the rinse when the door slammed open hard enough to bounce off the wall. Dr. Sterling filled the doorway like a storm front moving in from the ocean. Nurse Rodriguez. Step away from that patient immediately. His voice carried the particular coldness of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Katie's hands froze, gauze suspended above the wound. Doctor, I'm following the wound care protocol exactly as written. The dressing change is due today at the protocol you're clearly incapable of understanding, clipboard. He said the nickname the way a surgeon might describe a contaminated instrument. Katie felt something shift in the room, the mother's grip tightening on the father's arm, Webb's jaw clenching, the fluorescent light overhead seeming to buzz louder. Look at this family. Their son survived Afghanistan. He survived things you couldn't comprehend, and you're giving him an infection with your incompetent technique. Gloves contaminated. Sterile field compromised. Did you even graduate nursing school or did you buy your degree online? The mother gasped. A small sound, sharp as breaking glass. Katie's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of maintaining composure. One tear escaped before she could stop it. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. The wound shows no signs of infection, doctor. The culture from yesterday came back negative. All vitals are stable. His oxygen saturation is. You don't get to question me, clipboard. Sterling leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that somehow carried further. You don't get to contradict me in front of patients. You document what I tell you to document. You follow my orders without discussion. Is that understood? Katie finished the dressing. Her hands moved with deliberate calm, each motion controlled, each gesture a refusal to shatter. She sealed the sterile field, disposed of the contaminated materials, removed her gloves with the precision of someone who'd learned that discipline was power. The wound is clean, doctor. No complications. She stepped back from the bed. Sterling's smile was the smile of a man who'd just watched something break exactly as he'd intended. He stayed in the room for another minute, talking to Webb's parents about monitoring for subtle signs of infection and the importance of experienced oversight, his presence a weight pressing down like storm clouds before rain. Katie left the room and didn't let herself breathe until she reached the medication room. Her hand shook as she restocked supplies. 3 minutes. That was all it had taken, 3 minutes for everyone on the unit to know her name meant failure. By lunch, the story would be different. By tomorrow, it would be a legend about the incompetent new nurse who didn't know sterile technique. The break room at 11:16 a.m. was a study in fluorescent starkness. 16 grey chairs, a refrigerator that hummed like an aging animal, a wall of mailboxes above a laminate table scarred with coffee ring stains. Katie entered carrying her lunch in a cloth bag, turkey sandwich, apple, the thermos of coffee she'd made at 5 that morning. She sat at the table center, unwrapped the sandwich, and took a bite. Within 15 seconds, 6 nurses rose in perfect choreography. Chairs scraping against tile. Containers snapping shut. Meaningful glances exchanged like coded messages. One nurse stood so quickly her chair fell backward and she didn't bend to right it. They filed out through different doors, one toward the supply room, 2 toward the bathroom, 2 toward the main hallway, and Katie sat alone under flickering lights that buzzed like insects trapped in plastic. The sandwich tasted like sawdust. She set it down. This was the geometry of ostracism. This was how hospitals enforced conformity. Not with overt cruelty, but with coordinated absence. With the sound of her colleagues choosing anywhere else. That afternoon, Dr. Sterling posted the disciplinary write-up on the unit board where everyone passed, the corridor junction between the main unit and the supply room, where it couldn't be missed. The paper was official. White background, hospital seal, his signature crisp and authoritative. Nurse Cade Rodriguez, written warning for insubordination and negligent patient care practices. Further incidents will result in immediate termination. Staff gathered like iron filings to a magnet. Whispers. Finger pointing. Meaningful nods that confirmed what everyone now believed. Katie read it twice, committing every word. She felt the weight of the moment, the exact second when a reputation turned into a liability. This was Sterling's masterwork. This was the move that transformed rumor into documentation. She took one measured breath. Her voice came out steady, almost conversational. The truth has a way of surviving lies, Doctor. Sterling was watching from the nurse's station, arms crossed, expression pleased. He smiled. The truth is what I write in your file, Nurse Rodriguez. Remember that. He turned back to his computer, confident that the game was already won. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Katie had spent the past 2 weeks photographing documents. 3 invoices showing supplies billed at triple market rate. 47 patients following an identical pattern. All signed by Dr. Sterling. All moving money somewhere it shouldn't go. She had the dates memorized. She had the account numbers. She had spent 17 years in military intelligence learning how to gather information without leaving traces, and she'd done exactly that at Oak Creek Memorial. She just hadn't told anyone yet. That evening, as Katie left the hospital parking lot, the San Diego skyline turned purple against the ocean. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to someone she hadn't spoken to in a decade, a former colleague from Helmand Province, someone who'd transferred to NCIS and never looked back. Just 4 words, I need your help. The response came within minutes. A phone number. A time, 8 p.m. A location, a coffee shop in Ocean Beach where nobody from Oak Creek ever went. That night, she would sit across from a woman in a dark blazer and hand over 3 photographs and a list of names. That woman would nod slowly and say, "You've done good work, Senior Chief. We'll take it from here." But Katie didn't know that yet. Right now, she was driving home past palm trees and strip malls, past the city lights beginning to glow like embers, past the cardboard box in her backseat that held her life before Oak Creek, a photograph of her team in Helmand Province, a military challenge coin she kept in her scrub pocket, and the combat boots she'd earned the right to wear. She was a woman with a secret, and that secret was about to change everything, not just for her, but for a hospital that had decided she was expendable. The next morning would bring new developments. The patient in room for 12 would begin his subtle decline. The medical records clerk would disappear his file request. And Katie would discover that saving a life required more than medical knowledge. It required the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It whispers. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial settled into that peculiar quiet that comes at 2,300 hours, when the visiting families have left and the hospital breathes differently. Katie moved through room for 12 with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done field medicine under fire, a skill that made routine hospital rounds feel almost meditative. Captain Marcus Webb lay motionless in the darkness, his eyes tracking her movement with the intensity of someone who couldn't speak but heard everything. She'd checked on him at 22:45. At 2300, something had changed. His oxygen saturation read 89. 2 hours ago it had been 96. Katie's hand stilled on the pulse oximeter. The number glowed steady, accusatory. She leaned closer to Webb's chest, listening to breath sounds that had grown shallow, almost distant. His respiratory rate was climbing, 28 breaths per minute when it should have been 16. His neck veins bulged against his skin like rope pulled too tight. Katie's eyes moved to his trachea and she felt something shift in her chest, that moment of recognition that separates routine from crisis. The trachea was deviating right. Tension pneumothorax. The clinical presentation was textbook, precise as a written diagnosis. Air trapped in the pleural space, compressing the lung, shifting the mediastinum, building pressure with every breath Webb took. Hypoxia creeping in. Death waiting behind the monitors if nobody intervened in the next 5 minutes. Katie reached for the call button without hesitation, her voice level as glass. I need the attending immediately. Room for 12. Respiratory decompensation. The charge nurse acknowledged, already moving toward the phone. Katie remained at Webb's bedside, her hands beginning their assessment, palpating his neck, assessing jugular venous pressure, counting respirations, reading the story his body was telling. Webb's eyes found hers and held. He was afraid, but his face remained composed. A warrior's face. She recognized that mask. I'm going to help you, Katie said quietly. Stay with me. The charge nurse's voice crackled over the overhead speaker. Dr. Sterling is 15 minutes out. He's coming now. 15 minutes was too long. Katie watched the monitors climb higher, oxygen saturation dropping to 85, then 82. Webb's lips were taking on that bluish tint, cyanosis creeping in from the extremities. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm beside him, indifferent to the biology failing beneath its sensors. Katie's mind catalogued distances. Helmand Province was 7,000 miles away, but the muscle memory lived in her hands like a second heartbeat. She'd done this procedure 4 times under rocket fire. Once at FOB Shank with incoming mortars shaking the walls. Once in the back of a Black Hawk. Once in a ditch outside Sanjin Valley with a Marine bleeding out from a tension pneumothorax and nothing but a needle and the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're already dead unless you move. But that was when she was officially dead, a senior chief petty officer in a unit that officially didn't exist, operating under classified orders that meant she could do impossible things in impossible places. Here, at Oak Creek Memorial, she was just a nurse. The phone to the nurse's station rang. Katie heard Dr. Sterling's voice, thin and urgent, crackling through the receiver. The charge nurse relayed it immediately. Do not let Rodriguez perform any procedures. Nobody touches that patient but me. I'm 15 minutes out. She is not authorized. The charge nurse looked at Katie with the specific helplessness of someone caught between orders and basic human decency. Katie didn't acknowledge the message. She was watching Webb's oxygen saturation slide to 78%. She was watching a man who'd survived Kandahar, who'd carried her son's team out of an ambush, who'd held the line while others broke, watching him suffocate in an air-conditioned hospital room while bureaucracy and liability held everyone still. Katie's hands moved. She reached for the emergency decompression kit, her fingers moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of authority that came from staying conscious while entire rooms fell apart around her. Get me a witness and document everything. The order wasn't a request. The charge nurse pulled a respiratory therapist from the hallway. Both of them stood frozen as Katie's hands moved through preparation, gloved, prepped with betadine, positioned at the anatomical landmark she could find in darkness. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The needle was 14 gauge, the kind she'd used in Helmand when there was no time for hesitation and the only authority that mattered was whether the person lived or died. Emergency needle decompression for tension pneumothorax under imminent threat to life, Katie said, speaking for the record, speaking for the documentation that would either save her or destroy her. Patient refusing verbal acknowledgement. No time for consent protocols. Webb's eyes closed. His chin inclined slightly, the closest thing to a nod a mute man could give. The needle slid between his ribs. The angle was perfect, the depth was perfect, the moment was perfect because Katie had practiced it 200 times in training and performed it when it actually mattered. The hiss of escaping air filled the room like a held breath finally released. The sound of pressure equalizing, of atmosphere rushing out, of life returning. Webb's oxygen saturation climbed to 91. Then 94. Then 97%. His color returned in waves, pink spreading back into his cheeks like a flush. His respiratory rate dropped from 28 to 20. The bulging neck veins receded. His lips lost their bluish tint. Katie secured the catheter with tape and gloved precision, her hands rock steady as if she were working at a field hospital instead of a civilian trauma unit. The trachea shifted back to center. The mediastinum relaxed. The emergency collapsed into routine. 12 minutes later, Dr. Sterling rushed into room for 12 with a team at his heels, his eyes scanning Webb, stable, pink, breathing normally, and then landing on Katie with an expression that mixed fury with something colder. Calculation. She was still a threat, but now she was a threat who'd just saved a patient he'd been seconds away from losing. Webb's eyes were locked on Katie with a kind of intensity that transcended words. He'd been dying. He knew he'd been dying. And he knew exactly who'd pulled him back. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened as he studied the catheter placement, the documentation, the vital sign trends. Katie stood beside the bed with her hands at her sides, her expression blank, waiting. The charge nurse and respiratory therapist had already melted back into the hallway. The only people left in the room were a doctor whose empire had just been saved by a nurse he'd tried to destroy, and two people, one mute, one silenced, who understood that everything had just changed. "I want a full report on the incident," Dr. Sterling said quietly, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, dangerous in its restraint. "Every detail documented." Katie met his eyes without flinching. "Already done, Doctor." The moment stretched between them, thin, lethal, full of things that couldn't be said. Dr. Sterling turned and left, his mind already working, already calculating what this meant, already searching for the angle he'd need to weaponize this against her. She'd saved a patient. That made her a hero for now. But heroes could be destroyed too. It just took strategy. Katie turned back to Webb and adjusted the catheter tape, her hands moving through the practice motions of post-procedure care. Webb's hand moved across the bedsheet and his fingers found hers for just a moment. Not gratitude. Recognition. The kind of acknowledgement that passed between people who'd survived things that officially hadn't happened. The clock on the wall read 2,317 hours. Katie had just saved Captain Marcus Webb's life by violating direct orders from the attending physician. She'd documented it carefully, spoken it for the record, and done everything right for all the wrong reasons from an institutional standpoint. By morning, Dr. Sterling would have had time to think. By morning, he would have a strategy. But tonight, at 2,317 hours, a man was breathing who shouldn't have been, and Katie Rodriguez stood at his bedside knowing that the fight she'd won in the next 5 minutes had already cost her everything. Webb's eyes closed. He was alive. And that was all that mattered. She smoothed her gloves and stepped back from the bed, her voice returning to the quiet, deferential tone she wore like armor. "Rest now, Captain. I'll check on you in 30 minutes. As she turned toward the door, her fingers brushed against the old combat boots she'd left wedged at the foot of the locker room bench, the pair that still carried the red dust of Helmand Province, the scars of a life that officially no longer existed. Tomorrow they might find a way to bury her? But tonight, she'd saved someone who mattered. And that was worth whatever came next. Dr. Sterling arrived at 0700 with the HR director, a woman whose name Katie never learned, and a manila folder that felt heavier than its weight should allow. The hospital corridor at sunrise had that peculiar emptiness, fluorescent lights casting everything in institutional grey, the smell of floor stripper and antiseptic hanging thick in the air like a warning. "Conference room," Sterling said. Not a request. Not a command dressed as one. Just a statement of fact, the tone of a man who'd spent enough years wielding authority that he no longer bothered with the theatre of politeness. Katie followed. Her mind was already 3 moves ahead. She'd saved Captain Webb. The man was alive because she'd moved fast, because her hands remembered what 15 years of classified medicine had taught them, because some knowledge doesn't fade, it just waits underneath the surface like scar tissue. She'd expected anger. She'd expected retaliation. What she hadn't expected was how quickly it would come, how surgical, how utterly calculated. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of 100 terminated employees. Sterling sat across from her. The HR director positioned herself at the head of the table, a neutral territory position that was anything but neutral. The folder opened. A pre-printed termination letter lay on the polished mahogany surface, her name already typed in. "Nurse Rodriguez," Sterling began, and Katie heard the satisfaction in his voice, the sound of a man who'd finally cornered something that had been causing him problems. "You performed an unauthorized invasive procedure in direct violation of a physician's direct order. Needle decompression. Emergency cricothyrotomy protocol. That's specialty-level training." He paused, letting the word settle. "You're terminated effective immediately for gross insubordination and practicing beyond your scope." Katie's jaw tightened. She didn't look at the letter. She looked at Sterling, and when she spoke, her voice stayed level, the kind of level that comes from having already survived worse. "Much worse. I saved his life. The standard of care requires." "The standard is following orders," Sterling interrupted. He was leaning forward now, his voice dropping into that predatory register. "And I want to know where you learned that procedure, Nurse Rodriguez. That's not nursing school. That's not a standard ACLS certification. That's emergency medicine. Military medicine. Combat medicine." His eyes narrowed. He smelled blood in the water now. "Want to explain that?" The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song. Katie's hands remained folded on the table. Her training had taught her silence was a weapon sharper than any blade. But Sterling was looking for an explanation, and explanations required her to surface information that lived in classified files she wasn't permitted to access under federal secrecy orders she'd sworn to uphold even in death. She'd been ordered to disappear after Helmand Province went sideways, after a black operation involving a bombing run that killed a Taliban commander and saved 200 civilians in a village that officially didn't exist in a province where she was never stationed. "I have emergency training," she said carefully. "From years ago." "From where?" Sterling's voice had taken on a hunting quality. "Show me your certifications." "What program? Which hospital? Which military contract?" She couldn't. The certifications were locked in a file cabinet at JSOC headquarters, stamped with clearances she wasn't supposed to acknowledge existed. Her entire service record had been redacted, filed away, buried so deep that officially, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez was nothing more than a ghost, erased by the same government that had trained her to appear and disappear at command. Sterling studied her silence the way a shark studies blood in water. He already knew. Or he suspected enough that the truth didn't matter, what mattered was that she couldn't defend herself, and he understood exactly why. "I think we're done here," he said quietly, and signaled security with a gesture so small it was almost invisible. 2 guards appeared in the doorway. Not threatening. Just present. Inevitable. You have 30 minutes to clear your locker, Sterling continued, sliding the termination letter across the table. It came to rest against her folded hands. Someone will escort you from the building. Your badge access will be revoked immediately. Any questions? Katie stood. She didn't take the letter. She didn't need to. The words were already burned into her memory, the clinical language of institutional violence, the sterile bureaucracy of erasure. She'd seen it before, just in different forms: military discharge papers, security clearances revoked, operations scrubbed from official records. The government was very good at making people disappear. Sterling had just done the hospital's version. She walked to her locker in the staff room. Her hands moved steadily, she didn't let them shake, didn't let the tremor that lived in her chest show on her face. A cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" came out of the top shelf, a gift from her son 3 years ago. A dying succulent with brown leaves that she'd been keeping alive through sheer force of will despite every reason it should have died months ago. Her personal phone. A photograph in a sealed plastic bag, her team in Helmand Province, 8 faces framed against sandstone mountains. Herself, younger, harder, with a different name on the uniform. 7 others. All of them dead now except her? She placed everything into the cardboard box a security guard handed her. The same guard who'd walked past her dozens of times in the hallway, who'd nodded at her in the elevator, who'd probably been instructed to expect this moment the day Sterling decided she was a liability. There was no malice in his face. Just the neutral expression of someone doing a job. The rain started before she reached the bus stop on 4th Street. Not the gentle kind that asks permission. The kind that hammers against the pavement like applause at a funeral, that turns the afternoon grey and cold and indifferent. Katie stood under the inadequate shelter of the bus stop's plastic roof, the cardboard box growing soggy at the edges, rain drumming against its cardboard skin like a metronome counting down. She wiped her face. It was impossible to tell if it was rain or tears. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the distinction stopped meaning anything after you'd lost enough. A bus splashed past, spraying water across the curb, and didn't stop for her. Her phone buzzed. Her son calling. She stared at the screen, watching his name flash. She couldn't answer. How could she explain this? How could she tell him that she'd been erased, that the secret she'd been buried under was deeper than she could acknowledge, that the federal secrecy orders that governed her entire existence meant she couldn't even defend herself against the man who destroyed her career because the truth would mean violating orders that transcended civilian law? She let it go to voicemail. The rain continued. A couple rushed past under a shared umbrella, and Katie watched them go, their bodies leaning into each other as if they believed the world could be trusted. She'd forgotten how to do that. Somewhere in the mountains of Helmand Province, 15 years ago, she'd learned that the world was a calculation, that people were either assets or liabilities, that survival meant assuming nothing was safe and no one could be trusted to keep you alive except yourself. She looked down at the photograph through the plastic, at the face of the woman she used to be. That woman had made choices. That woman had done things that now couldn't be explained, couldn't be defended, couldn't be disclosed without committing federal crimes. That woman had saved 200 lives and disappeared so completely that officially she'd never existed at all. And that woman was still in here somewhere, Katie realized. Still living in the muscle memory of her hands, the tactical precision of her movements, the composure that kept her standing in the rain without flinching, without breaking, without surrendering even when the world had already decided she was disposable. A second bus came and stopped. Katie didn't board it. She just stood there, watching other people get on, watching the doors close, watching the bus pull away into the rain-soaked afternoon. Somewhere in this city, Captain Webb was waking up in a hospital bed, breathing air that Katie's hands had earned for him. Somewhere in that hospital, Dr. Sterling was erasing her from the system, deleting her credentials, rewriting the official record to say that she'd never been there at all. But that wasn't the worst part. 1 week later, Katie was wiping down table 7 at Rose's diner when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. 3 times a day someone called about hospital positions she'd never taken, coffee delivery apps she'd never signed up for, collections agencies looking for people who didn't exist. But something made her slide her thumb across the screen. Senior Chief Rodriguez. A woman's voice, crisp, official. This is Captain Jennifer Webb. My father, Marcus Webb, is asking for you. He's awake. He's asking. A pause. We don't have much time. Can you come back? Katie's hands went still. The rag dripped suds onto her apron. Awake. Captain Webb, the mute veteran, her son's commanding officer, the man she'd pulled back from the edge of a cliff made of blood and pneumothorax and silence. He was asking for her by name, which meant he could identify her, which meant everything was about to change in ways she couldn't control. I'll be there in 15 minutes, Katie said. She didn't ask permission. She walked into the kitchen, untied her apron, and left it on the stainless steel counter. The manager didn't even look up from the grill. Some jobs were never meant to be kept. The parking lot was wet from morning rain, and her borrowed Honda Civic smelled like previous owners and regret. Katie drove faster than she should, hands steady at 10 and 2, thoughts already 3 steps ahead. The hospital would be chaos. Administration would have been briefed. Sterling might be there, or he might not, didn't matter. She had something now that she didn't have a week ago. Leverage. Truth. A witness who could speak to what really happened in that room. Oak Creek Memorial rose against the San Diego skyline like a monument to forgotten things. Katie took the employee lot entrance, habit, muscle memory, and then caught herself. She wasn't an employee anymore. She parked near the ER entrance and walked in through the front doors like a civilian. The lobby was crowded. That was the first sign something massive had shifted. A woman in a charcoal suit was talking to security. 3 men in dark windbreakers with FBI embroidered across the chest stood near the information desk. A news crew was setting up equipment by the windows. Katie's instinct was to move quietly, blend into the landscape, vanish. Instead, she walked straight toward the elevators. Katie. A hand caught her elbow gently. Sarah Webb, Marcus's daughter, mid-30s, tear-stained cheeks, eyes the same slate gray as her father's. Thank God. He won't stop asking for you. He wrote your name on a notepad 12 times. 12 times. They moved together toward the bank of elevators. As the doors slid open, Katie saw the 4th floor waiting for her like a mouth about to swallow her whole. Room for 12 was no longer a hospital room. It was an assembly of truth. Captain Marcus Webb lay propped on pillows, his color better than Katie had expected, but his eyes were doing all the talking his throat couldn't. His daughter stood beside the bed. The charge nurse from the 4th floor stood in a corner, looking like someone who'd just survived a car crash. A tall woman with short gray hair and an FBI windbreaker sat in the plastic chair. And then there were 3 people Katie hadn't seen before. One was a man in an Oxford button-down with his hand wrapped in gauze. He was thin, weathered, with the kind of scar tissue across his jaw that told a story no one wanted to hear. Behind him stood a translator, a woman with kind eyes and a notebook. And then there was him. Another man, this one dressed in traditional Afghan clothing, turban and all, sitting with his hands folded and his eyes locked on Katie's face. When he saw her, he stood. His face crumpled. His voice came out in Pashto, rough and trembling. The translator stepped forward. He says you're the American angel. The one who spared his village. Kandahar Province. He says he recognizes your face. He says you argued with your commanders for hours. He says you refused the airstrike. The translator's own voice wavered. He says you nearly faced court-martial. That you chose humanity over orders. Katie's chest tightened. That operation. That day. The one that had broken her in ways that didn't show on any medical imaging. The one that had gotten her erased and exiled and turned into a ghost in her own life. Thank you, the man said in accented English. You saved my village. 200 children. The room became very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when the truth walks in and everyone stops breathing at the same time. The door opened again. A man in dress white stepped through, navy dress uniform gleaming, chest full of medals arranged in perfect ascending order. Behind him came 2 FBI agents and, Katie's breath caught, Commander Patterson from the 75th Ranger Regiment, the man who'd signed off on her extraction 15 years ago. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, the Navy officer said. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, controlled, powerful, restrained. I'm Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes, SEAL Team 3. I'm here to tell you what everyone in this room needs to know about who you actually are. He stepped forward with a manila folder. Bronze Star. He opened it. Photographs, commendations, official seals. Silver Star. Another document slid out. Second Silver Star. And then one more, this one bordered in gold. Navy Cross. Helmand Province operations. 214 civilians evacuated under fire. 37 Taliban combatants neutralized. 0 civilian casualties. Every single one because you refused to follow orders that would have killed innocents. Captain Webb's hand reached out, trembling. He gripped Katie's wrist. His eyes were doing everything his voice couldn't do. She felt the transmission of gratitude, recognition, the simple overwhelming weight of being seen after decades of living in shadows. An FBI agent stepped forward. Her name tag read Agent Chen. She had the kind of face that said she'd delivered impossible truths before and would do it again. Dr. Sterling's billing fraud spans across 47 patients over 6 years. $17 million. We have bank transfers to offshore accounts. We have emails between Sterling and executives at MedSupply Solutions Incorporated. We have recorded conversations where he discusses how to handle the Rodriguez problem. She looked at Katie directly. He said, that new hire is going to tank my entire operation. She has to disappear. Those are his exact words. We have them on an audio recording from his call to his attorney on March 14 at 2:17 in the morning. The door burst open again. Dr. Sterling stood in the threshold, his face already grey, already knowing. Behind him came security, the same guard who'd handed Katie her cardboard box with the cracked mug and dying succulent. Behind Sterling came Board Chairman Hartman, his expression cycling through shock and calculation and finally, resignation. Katie watched Sterling's face drain of color like someone had pulled a plug. His hands were shaking. His mouth opened and closed. This is insane. I have lawyers. I have connections to. 17 lawyers, Commander Patterson interrupted, his voice carved from ice. 14 of them we arrested this morning on corruption charges. The other 4 are cooperating with federal prosecutors. They're giving testimony that implicates you in a kickback scheme involving 3 major medical suppliers and 1 sitting city councilman. Security approached Sterling with an identical cardboard box. The symbolism was intentional, devastating, the kind of poetry that only justice understands. Your personal items, Doctor, the guard said quietly. I believe you know the way out, sir. Sterling stood there holding that box like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The parallel to Katie's own departure 1 week ago was so precise, so perfect, that something inside her shifted. Not forgiveness. Never that. But completion. Closure. The universe had a sense of proportion after all. You can't do this, Sterling said, but his voice had become a whisper, a thing diminishing. We can, Agent Chen said. And we have. One by one, the staff who'd been present at Katie's humiliation began to appear in the hallway. The charge nurse who'd stood silent when Sterling tore her apart in front of the Gold Star family. The lab technician who'd left the break room when Katie sat down. The dietary aide who'd watched the disciplinary write-up get posted on the unit board and said nothing. They came forward, tears streaming, apologies falling like rain. I didn't know, someone whispered. I thought you were. It's okay, Katie said, and she meant it, and she didn't mean it, and both things were true simultaneously. Captain Marcus Webb couldn't speak, so he wrote. His hands shook as he gripped the pen, as he formed letters on the notepad his daughter held. When he finished, Sarah read his words aloud. She saved my life in Kandahar. She saved my life here. Some debts you never stop owing. The Afghan man pressed his hand to his heart, the gesture of respect between warriors, between people who understood what it meant to stand in the gap and hold the line. And then, because time moves forward whether we want it to or not, 6 months passed like a page turning. Katie stood in the newly renamed Veterans Care Unit at Oak Creek Memorial, looking at the nameplate on her white coat, Director of Veteran Services. The word still felt like someone else's title, borrowed, temporary. But her hands knew better. Her hands had touched 15 patients that morning. Her hands had reviewed 12 patient charts. Her hands had signed the orders that would have taken Sterling years to forge. On her desk sat the pair of worn combat boots Marcus Webb had given her the day he was discharged. The leather was scuffed, the laces frayed, the heel worn down on the left side from favoring a wound that had never fully healed. Every morning, Katie touched those boots before starting her rounds. It was a ritual that had no logical explanation, which meant it had everything to do with truth. The photograph from Helmand Province hung on the wall beside her desk. 12 faces. 11 of them dead now, killed in operations or accidents or the slow erosion of combat's aftereffects. Katie the only one who'd survived, who'd been extracted, who'd been given a second life in a diner wiping down tables and a third life standing in this room with authority that looked like a white coat but felt like recognition. Her phone buzzed. Her son's text is, "Mom, tonight? 8 p.m.? There's someone I want you to meet." 8 months they hadn't spoken. She'd been erased from his life the same way Sterling had tried to erase her from Oak Creek. But erasure, Katie had learned, never worked. The truth had a way of surviving lies. The truth had muscle memory. The truth came back with compound interest. Katie texted back, "Yeah, I'll be there." Captain Webb was in speech therapy on the second floor, his voice returning in fragments and whispers. The doctor said another 2 months and he'd have most of it back. His daughter brought him in twice a week. His daughter, who'd reached out to Katie the second her father woke up, who'd moved heaven and earth to make sure the truth came out. The former Taliban commander, Katie never learned his real name. They kept referring to him only as the patient, had recovered from his wounds and returned to Afghanistan. But he'd sent letters. 3 of them. The first described the school he was building in his village. He named it after her. Madrasa Katie. Katie's school. The letters came through a protection service, anonymized, untraceable, evidence of a life saved that Katie had never expected to save. The board chairman had resigned. 14 medical suppliers faced federal charges. The hospital recovered $8 million in fraudulent billing. The news crews left after 2 weeks. The television vans parked in the lot disappeared. The normal people forgot about it because normal people forgot about everything that didn't directly affect their morning commute. But Oak Creek Memorial didn't forget. The break room was different now. When Katie entered, people made space. When she offered her opinion, people listened. When she moved through the corridors, the fluorescent light seemed to hum just a little softer. She paused at the window overlooking the parking lot, the one where that bus stop still stood in the distance. Rain fell again today, light and persistent, the same rain that had fallen on her face when she stood there a week ago with everything she owned in a cardboard box. But she was inside now. Warm. Steady. Her hands were still steady. Katie touched the worn combat boots one more time before her next round. Her fingers traced the frayed laces, the scuffed leather, the places where another warrior had walked through fire and somehow made it out. The boots were a reminder of something people never understood, that sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes. Sometimes they carry hope when everyone else has dropped theirs on the floor and walked away. Sometimes they choose humanity over orders, and they pay the price, and they survive, and they come back, and they win not with violence but with persistence. With time. With the quiet refusal to disappear. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been silenced, if you've ever known someone who refused to give up on you when everyone else had already written you off, like this video, subscribe, and share Katie's story. Because the world needs to know that heroes live among us, that they wear scrubs, that they move through our hospitals and our lives, changing everything with a single refusal to accept an unjust order. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding it all together. What would you have done in Katie's position? Comment below.